Hello, I'm Matt Mason, and this is a part of the virtual program notes for the Altered Bodies piano recital. And for this episode, I am joined by Alex Lenaers to talk about his work, Disconnection, Fragmentation, and Unification.
Hello, hi.
So, with these pieces and with this virtual program notes, really what I want this to be is an opportunity for listeners who have seen the program, who have heard the pieces, to take some time to meet the composers, learn about the background of the piece, but also get to know you and your work more widely. So, of course, I have to start with the titles because I think titles are such an important element to all of these disconnection, fragmentation, and unification. So a little bit of background, the piece is in three component parts. I would assume that that has something to do with why it's titled as such, but what was the inspiration for the titling, or rather what came first, the title or the composition?
Yeah, it's really not a super unique or creative name. Basically, it's just the idea of kind of the prompt for this concert was, the relationship between how things are now and with the pandemic and before, and it's basically just things were bad, disconnected, things got fragmented, and then they were starting to unify them as we come back. It's yeah, just a play on that. And basically the idea, the title itself is a pretty big abstraction of the idea. So it kind of came together at the same time as the concept of the piece. Like you said, it's in three parts, and each clause, if you want to call it that, of the title, describes each of the movements.
Yeah, nice. And so with this, I think that your point immediately there about it being a movement-based piece is always really interesting to me as a pianist when I'm composing a lot. I'm thinking in very small movements. Madonna, which is also on this concert, is an 8 movement work technically, but played as this kind of through composed composition. So, um, how do you conceive of this piece as three distinct movements, or do you feel that any of the movements could stand on their own? Like a Beethoven piano sonata, a person might only play the first movement, but with this, the interconnectivity of it, um, what do you think about kind of the discrete movements as ideas?
Yeah, the at least in my music as of lately, it's not a super. There's not a lot of discrete structures. I've you mentioned Madonna. I've also been doing a lot of very, like, you could call them miniatures, I guess, but very small sections that you could, for some reason or another, kind of classify into different movements or sections. What that actually means, it's very not classical or Baroque, or it's not very Stravinsky. Yeah, they're all Attacca, and yeah, it's more of the idea of, it's kind of a way to parse the music more for the performer than a way to parse it as the listener. The idea is to kind of have it blend, but give a little bit of structure so you can have a little bit of form to vary. And at least for this piece, the idea of having an individual movement by itself doesn't physically work, because the fragmentation piece is the big bit there, if you want to call it that, is there's recording of the live part of the first segment, that's put through a granular synthesizer. So that second part doesn't work without the first, and the third part is, there's a particular form to it, but that is just essentially a big callback to the first. It's a big, A B A prime kind of deal. Yeah.
Yeah, and you open and close with this it's kind of a harmonic motive. It's the E flat 7 chord in the left hand, and then in the right
Mm.
hand, it is a dyad of B and C sharp that opens up to G sharp and E, which happens both at the beginning and at the very close of the piece. And I was wondering, is that at all related to the Rite of Spring chord, since you just mentioned Stravinsky?
It is not. That was not my thinking, but I'd have to go back and look, but that does sound right. Yeah, not really. I should have just lied and said yes. That's a good. I like that. But yeah, the opening theme the opening bar is really, I try and encapsulate the entirety of the harmonic and melodic form in that one bar, because basically it's, you have the major seven, no five in the left hand, and in the right hand it's basically just intervals that are mirrored over C. And the whole piece has, basically it's just some set that, call it not chromatic planing. I forget the specific term, like in set theory, or like Jacob Collier calls it negative harmony. But basically, just the reflection mirroring over a particular, axis point, and in that point, it's basically just, a semitone above and below C, and then it expands, and that's a lot of the piece is just that the idea of mirrored over a particular pitch. So that's the first bar is just those two ideas that get expanded.
Nice. That's great. Yeah, I hadn't actually caught that as being reflective in that way, which is really interesting. Then when you take the form of this piece, which begins and ends the same way, it's a reflection. Oh, now you've got my theory brain rattling.
Sorry,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, and the
theory.
the first part is just essentially a retrograde of the, or sorry, the last part is a retrograde of the first part with pieces put in, because we're going to go back to the theme. We're going through all the same stuff we did, but we're more unified and we have more information, or it adds completion and adds contrast. But yeah.
See, that's it. Yeah, and oh now, yeah. So now I'm starting to see all of the mirrors. Oh,
And like the
that's
the Lydian
clever.
section, the Lydian section is all just, it's the intervals mirrored over C, and it's the tetrachord. Yeah.
That takes away now what I was going to say, which is actually in the way that you've kind of composed this. It's very reminiscent to me. We talked about form and the way that these structures are laid out. I think, first of all, you could just call this then an arch form overall. But I was getting, while practicing it, this almost ballade like structure. And while I think like the Chopin ballades are, first of all, excellent pieces, I think that Liszt actually really clarifies for me this ballade structure where there are distinct and discrete ideas that kind of come back and are extrapolated on. Uh, the Liszt second ballade, it's all the same theme, but it's been slightly harmonized. It's been slightly chromatified, which is really cool. And it kind of keeps expanding. And so while I've been practicing it, it's been taking me back to that piece, which I performed during my master's, and just in the figuration, which what I liked in practicing this too is you've got this kind of juxtaposition, I think, of very traditional pianistic textures, melody and accompaniment lines, particularly when you've got that kind of rolling left hand arpeggio while the right hand is doing those triplets, the da 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 da, super pianistic, which then kind of gets pushed back against in some of these more independent polyphonic sections that kind of break up that repetition. What were you thinking about in terms of texture as and I guess piano tradition as you were composing?
I'm very glad to hear that it's pianistic. Because I'm a string player primarily. So like in a lot of the way I kind of structure the things are, some of the more traditional stuff is very like, I looked at like Ravel Piano Trio and Rachmaninoff, I think two piano concerto or whatever. Yeah, just a lot of very like classic piano stuff. Um, you know, Juxtaposed to, like you said, the stuff that's very intentionally disjointed and disconnected. Yeah, and basically just the idea is just the contrast between them. Trying to to highlight them and maybe not emphasize is the right word, but really, yeah, focus on how they shift between. It's a very rapid change.
Yeah, and in creating those kind of rapidly changing textures, I think that there is a very distinct and kind of recognizable narrative throughout. And I find that even when narrative is not intentional in piano works, it still kind of emerges, especially the unification section where you have this kind of collapsing uh this collapsing chordal moment, which is
Yeah.
obviously mirrored in its ascension during the first segment, but it's that open E major chord that starts to fall. The planing of that reminded me so much of Debussy as well. But then it immediately gets kind of taken away by um this pulsating left hand that kind of comes in and tears away a little bit at the foundation of that, which I think is a really nice moment in the piece and definitely one that listeners should listen for.
That's very sweet. Yeah, that's very awesome. I will take that compliment. Thank you.
So I have one kind of last question then with this, which is when you think about improvisation, and especially improvisation in a kind of traditional medium that is, the piano recital or piano concert. How are you thinking of improvisation, or rather through what lens are you thinking of improvisation?
That's a really interesting question. A really, yeah, there's a lot of basically kind of the way I think of improv in my personal life, and this isn't the correct way or the right way, obviously. But for me, it's basically just kind of a reduction down to fundamentals and the root of what I know. So like, yeah, like thinking about for me tonal structures, even when something's not tonal, thinking about you know to put it in a I forget who originally told me this at one point, but like everything is some sort of 5 to 1. Everything's some sort of, you know, some sort of tension that leads to some sort of resolution. And that's, the point of the contrast. Thinking about all of those things in terms of where are we at, where is it going, and thinking about counterpoint in terms of like if you have individual not voices but components like with this particular piece with the granular synthesizer rather than voices I'm thinking about like variables in the synth like the grain duration versus like the space between how are those two factors moving and where do they want to go yeah very in my mind that's very fundamental to like if you're doing jazz, you do a 2-5-1. You're thinking about where pitches want to go, where your voice leading wants to go. If you're playing Bach, you're gonna think about, if you're on the 5, how long do you want to stay on the 5 within the form? If you're thinking about, you know, this piece, you're thinking about where do the variables want to go, where do they collapse, and how does that tension build over time?
Yeah, it's really interesting because in the kind of brief for this, as I have been working with these pieces and kind of soliciting these pieces from composers, uh, most composers have included some level of improvisation, which I find very flattering because it means that there's a little bit of trust in my ability to just make things up on the spot, which I love
With
to
my
see.
life, trust you with my life.
And Kevin Swenson's piece, Electric Dreamscape #3, has one of its core moments just be improvise on this previous fragment for this duration. And so yours has a similar idea, which is in the fragmentation, you are improvising on these. What I always find so fun with these, as opposed to, say, a Frederick Jeffsky composition, which has, improvise a cadenza for approximately this duration at this moment. Um, that kind of improvisation is very concert focused and it's very dependent on the material. In your type of improvisation and also in Swenson's improvisation, you get to have these kind of more dialogue based improvisations merely through the use of electronics. The moment that you introduce those, and especially in those improvisatory moments, it's kind of a challenge on the part of the performer to be able to react, respond, and almost communicate with the electronics as if it were an individual voice with agency, even though it's not. It's not making any particular choices. It's doing what the machine is kind of telling it to do, which I think is really fascinating. Then when you actually start to do these kinds of improvisations, um, you start to learn kind of moments throughout, like the electronics kind of do this thing, then it gets to improvise, then it gets to do this slight variation and change, and even though it's not responding to you as a performer and as a musician, it starts to feel like it's responding to you as a performer and a musician, just by the fact that we have kind of learned to communicate with it as such through these improvised moments. So I think that that's a really necessary core concept when doing any type of fixed media piece is, where do you as the performer, fixed media, live electronic piece, where do you have those moments where you can interact and treat it as a secondary player that is equally valid and equally important.
Yeah, that's beautiful and fantastic. That like you can even to not put it as eloquently as you thinking about when you're in high school and you're doing the musical and you have before the Stitz probe you have your backing tracks and there's no communication there and it doesn't gel and it doesn't sync and it's for all of those reasons pretty not good. Versus when you have, even if you have, a bunch of high schoolers playing, when you have communication and interaction, it links up. And having that, no matter what medium you're in, I think, because there's a lot of, I've heard a lot of live acoustic with, like fixed media or pre-recorded electronics or whatever, that are very not good because it's basically just like, yeah, it's like playing to a metronome that you're not listening to. There's no connection. There's no gelling. Um, so yeah, I'm a big fan of communication and improv being a part of the expression of performance. So
It then, it goes through that same kind of narrativistic track that when we're talking about COVID and the sudden boon in electronics and the way that people got so much better at Zoom and how we all had to communicate, the sheer nature of processing feels so much different while still largely being the same thing. The way that you and I are communicating right now, for instance, is it's the same as if we were in the same room, but we understand and we kind of recognize that the electronic component is in some ways facilitating this kind of communication, but it's also kind of interfering with it in ways which
yeah,
I think makes for a really interesting organic performance setting.
yeah.
So it will be super cool. I'm excited for you to come by and share your music with everyone. I want to ask one final question, which is, if you want people to remember or recall one thing from this performance or one moment from this piece, what is it?
Ooh, um, I don't know. I don't have an answer pulled up away. I have to think about it for a second. Um, yeah, experiment. Just try things, especially I'm assuming a lot of the people who are gonna engage with this uh, right away are gonna be other musicians and composers and things. yeah, experiment, try things. Because that's kind of this piece was a very experimental thing for me that I hadn't done before, and um, yeah, just do that. Little lackluster of a response, but
No, I think that the spirit of it is incredibly important. Improvisation and experimentation, it's the heart of what we do as composers, but it's also an incredibly important uh, journey for performers to take too, because they have to be able to understand and recognize liberties and develop a sense of taste in interpretation. And without the experimental phase of that, they never get to develop a unique identity. So,
yeah.
absolutely important. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Hear Alex's music on March 1st at the Altered Bodies concert. And if you're listening to this after the concert, I hope that you enjoyed it. And Alex, where could they find more of your music? Do you have a website?
I do. If you want to go to alexlenaers.com, ALEXLENAERS.com, or if you want to hit me up on Instagram or Facebook. I'm pretty young, so I got those too. As opposed to the wonderful Dr. Mason here, who is now a professor who,
I
as a music
also have
professor,
Instagram and Facebook.
but as a music professor now you have to be struggling with computers and stuff, and it's a whole thing. But
Oh, that's hurtfully true.